Two cops thought they'd caught an easy target. What they didn't know was that he ran the entire department. The sound of tires crunching gravel filled the quiet evening air as Michael Carter, a 48-year-old man with a calm demeanor and a reputation for leadership, turned onto Sycamore Avenue. He was coming home from a long but rewarding day, spent meeting with community leaders in Charlotte, North Carolina. His car, a modest black sedan, blended into the suburban streets, and his thoughts wandered to his wife's famous pot roast waiting at home. But then, blue and red lights flashed in his rearview mirror, slicing through the night like an alarm bell. Michael's grip on the steering wheel tightened momentarily. He checked his speedometer, 29 in a 35. No traffic violations, no broken taillights. Yet the patrol car's siren wailed, signaling him to stay calm, he muttered to himself as he signaled and eased his car to the side of the road. He knew the drill, hands visible, movements slow, polite demeanor. It was a routine he'd mastered, not because he'd ever done anything wrong, but because he'd learned that in these situations, appearances could mean everything. The officer approached his window briskly, flashlight in hand, its beam slicing through the dimly lit interior of Michael's car. Another officer lingered near the rear bumper, hand resting on his holstered weapon. "You in a hurry tonight?" the first officer barked, his tone dripping with suspicion. Michael responded evenly, his voice calm but firm. "Just heading home." The officer's flashlight swept over Michael's face, lingering just a second too long before darting down to his lap, his console, and then back to his face. "License and registration," he ordered, ignoring Michael's response. Michael reached slowly into his glove compartment, narrating every move. "I'm getting my registration now. My license is in my wallet. I'll reach for it after that." The officer didn't respond, but his posture stiffened. "Pulled you over?" the officer asked, though the question felt rhetorical. Before Michael could respond, the officer continued. "You were driving erratically back there, swerving into the other lane." Michael frowned. "With respect, sir, I wasn't swerving. My dash cam can verify." The officer cut him off sharply. "Dash cam, huh? That'll be confiscated for evidence. Step out of the vehicle." Michael blinked, surprised by the sudden escalation. "Is there a problem, officer? I'm complying fully." The officer's jaw tightened. "I said, step out of the vehicle." No. Michael's stomach churned, but he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door slowly, his hands raised in clear view. The second officer moved in quickly, grabbing Michael's arm and yanking him toward the patrol car. "Is this necessary?" Michael asked, his voice measured but firm. "I've done nothing wrong." "Resisting, huh?" the first officer sneered. "You want to play that game? Fine by." The cold metal of handcuffs bit into Michael's wrists. His mind raced. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was profiling, plain and simple. As the officers shoved him into the back of the squad car, Michael glanced down the street. A few neighbors peeked through their blinds, their silhouettes illuminated by the glow of their porch lights. No one stepped outside, but this was far from over. The officers had no idea who they had just arrested, and Michael wasn't planning to stay silent for long. The patrol car rattled slightly as it rolled down the street. Michael sat stiffly in the back seat, glancing out the window as familiar landmarks blurred past, but his mind wasn't on the scenery. Instead, he was trying to process the absurdity of what had just happened. The two officers sat up front, exchanging casual banter as though they hadn't just handcuffed and detained a man without cause. The younger one, Officer Martinez, glanced back at Michael through the rearview mirror. "So, what's your story? Late-night drug run, or you just like giving us a hard time?" Martinez asked with a... Michael met Martinez's gaze, unflinching. "I'm just a man trying to get home." Yeah, sure, the other officer, a stocky man named Officer Thompson, snorted. We hear that all the time. Reckless drivers always have an excuse. Arguing now wouldn't help. He took a deep breath, mentally running through his options. He knew his rights. He also knew the system, and the odds that it would favor him in this moment were slim. When they arrived at the precinct, the fluorescent lights cast a harsh glare over the holding area. Martinez removed Michael's cuffs with an almost mocking flourish. Welcome to our humble abode. You're going to be here for a while. Am I being charged? Michael asked calmly, rubbing his... Thompson smirked. We'll let you know once we figure that out. Sit. Michael was led into a small, cold holding cell. The door clanged shut behind him, the echo lingering in the air. He sat on the bench, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He'd spent years building a career rooted in justice and fairness, and now he was being subjected to the very abuse of power he'd worked to eradicate. Well, the two officers leaned against a desk, laughing quietly as they reviewed Michael's license and car registration. Nothing out of the ordinary, Martinez said, sounding almost disappointed. Thompson replied with a smirk. We'll find something. Guys like him always have skeletons in the closet. Exchange, his expression unreadable. He remained seated, hands clasped, posture steady. He wasn't angry, he was calculating. He knew his patience would pay off soon enough. Other officers came and went, casting curious glances at the man in the cell. None of them seemed to recognize him, but Michael didn't expect them to. He was new to the area, having taken the position only 3 weeks prior. Finally, just as dawn began to streak the sky with faint orange hues, Michael heard footsteps approaching. A stern-looking officer, clearly higher-ranking, appeared in front of the cell. Her badge read Lieutenant Harris. She carried an air of authority and professionalism that immediately contrasted with the other two officers. She frowned as she glanced at Michael, then back at the paperwork in her hand. What's going on here? Martinez stepped forward. Picked him up last night for reckless driving and resisting arrest. Harris arched an eyebrow. Reckless driving? Where's the evidence? We haven't processed it yet, Thompson said casually, leaning against the desk. Harris turned her attention back to Michael. Sir, do you have any idea why you were stopped? Michael stood, meeting her gaze calmly. I was told it was for reckless driving, which I categorically deny. I also have a dash cam that can verify my version of events. Her expression hardened as she glanced at the two officers. You didn't review his dash cam? Thompson shrugged. We didn't get to it yet. Sharply, clearly displeased. Get it now, and Martinez read my office, now. Slunk away. Michael knew the tide was beginning to turn. But this was just the beginning of their reckoning. The cold metal bench pressed against Michael's back as he sat in the holding cell, watching the precinct buzz with activity. The hours stretched endlessly, punctuated only by the occasional shuffle of papers or distant conversations. Despite the stillness around him, Michael's mind was anything but calm. He thought about the night's events, replaying them like a movie. Every sharp word, every unnecessary escalation, it all served as a stark reminder of the deep flaws he'd spent years fighting to fix. His new position as police chief had been an opportunity to address these issues from within, to create a culture of accountability. And now, here he was, experiencing the very injustice he had vowed to dismantle. The sound of footsteps brought him out of his thoughts. Lieutenant Harris returned, holding a tablet. She gestured for him to step closer to the bar. We reviewed your dash cam footage, she said, her tone clipped but professional. I've also spoken with the arresting officers. Let me be clear. This should never have happened. The footage contradicts their report entirely. Michael raised an eyebrow, not surprised, but still waiting for her to continue. Immediately, she added. But I'd like to discuss next steps privately. Moments later, Michael was out of the cell and seated across from Harris in her office. The room was stark, with a desk, a couple of chairs, and a small file cabinet. No frills, no distractions, just business. Report against Martinez and Thompson, Harris began, folding her hands on the desk. But there's something I need to ask. She hesitated, clearly weighing her words. Who are you, really? You're far too composed for someone who just spent the night in a holding cell over nothing. Slightly, giving her a small, measured smile. I appreciate your diligence, Lieutenant. But let's just say I've been in situations like this before. I've learned to stay calm. For a moment, then nodded. Fair enough. But I have a feeling this isn't the last we'll hear of this situation. Precinct, the early morning sun warmed his face, but the weight of the night lingered heavily on his shoulders. He didn't head straight home. Instead, he drove to his office, parked in his reserved space, and walked through the doors of the police headquarters he now oversaw. His assistant, Emily, looked up from her desk, startled. Chief Carter? You're here? Michael gave her a nod, his expression neutral. It's been a long night, Emily. Could you prepare a briefing room for me? I need to address the department this afternoon. Emily nodded quickly, sensing the gravity in his tone. As Michael stepped into his office and closed the door behind him, he exhaled deeply. He knew what was coming. This wasn't just about him, it was about what his experience represented. The public trusted him to lead, to protect, and to hold others accountable. That responsibility weighed heavily, but Michael welcomed it. But before he could act, there was one more storm to weather, the courtroom, where everything would come. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread quickly about the case, and local media outlets were eager to cover it. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but that didn't stop reporters from lining the courthouse steps, ready to pounce as soon as the hearing adjourned. Michael sat quietly at the defendant's table, his lawyer, Sophia Ramirez, flipping through a thick folder of evidence. Sophia was a force to be reckoned with, sharp, unrelenting, and with a reputation for dismantling weak arguments with surgical precision. Across the room, officers Martinez and Thompson sat with their department-appointed attorney. Martinez looked nervous, his foot tapping uncontrollably, while Thompson tried to appear unfazed, leaning back in his chair with a smug expression. The judge, an older man with a no-nonsense demeanor, entered the room and called the session to order. We are here today to address the charges brought against Mr. Michael Carter. Prosecution, you may proceed. The prosecutor, a young and somewhat hesitant lawyer, stood and began outlining the case as it was initially reported. On the night in question, the defendant was observed driving recklessly, swerving into another lane. Upon being stopped by officers Martinez and Thompson, he became uncooperative and resisted arrest. Suppressed a smile. She leaned over to Michael and whispered, "They're walking right into it." When it was her turn, Sophia stood confidently, her voice commanding the room. Your Honor, the charges against my client are not only baseless, but are also a direct result of racial profiling and abuse of power. To prove this, I'd like to present video evidence that directly contradicts the officer's statement. The judge nodded. Sophia gestured to the bailiff, who dimmed the lights and began playing the dashcam footage. The room fell silent as the video showed Michael driving steadily within his lane, the speedometer reading a constant 29 miles per hour. The officer's patrol car, visible in the rearview mirror, turned on its lights without cause. Body cam footage. The courtroom watched as the officers approached Michael's car, their aggressive tone evident from the first interaction. The footage revealed Martinez muttering under his breath. Another one of them causing trouble, followed by Thompson chuckling and replying, "Figures." Gasps rippled through the audience. The judge's brow furrowed deeply as he glanced at the officer. Sophia paused the video and addressed the court. "This is the professionalism displayed by Officers Martinez and Thompson. Now, let's fast forward to the arrest itself." The footage continued, showing Michael complying calmly, narrating his movements as he retrieved his registration and license. The contrast between his composed demeanor and the officer's hostility was stark. By the time the video finished, the courtroom was tense. Sophia turned to the jury and said, "This is not just an abuse of power. This is a direct violation of my client's rights, rooted in bias and..." Stood, visibly flustered. The officers believed they had probable cause. And sharply. Probable cause based on what? Driving safely? Following instructions? Or perhaps it was the color of his skin? The judge banged his gavel lightly, calling for order. "Counsel, keep this focus." Sophia's voice softened, but her words were no less powerful. "Your Honor, before we proceed further, my client has something to share with the..." Michael stood, adjusting his tie. He scanned the room, making eye contact with the officers before addressing the judge. "My name is Michael Carter," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I am the chief of police for this city. I was appointed 3 weeks ago to lead this department and address the very issues you've seen here today. I chose not to disclose my position earlier because I wanted the truth to come out organically, without bias or interference. And now it..." The in murmurs. Martinez's face turned pale, while Thompson's smugness evaporated in an instant. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, demanding silence. Michael continued, "This isn't just about me. This is about a system that allows officers like Martinez and Thompson to operate without accountability. That ends..." But this moment wasn't just a revelation. It was a reckoning, one that would reverberate far beyond the courtroom wall. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Michael took his seat, his final words hanging in the air like a thunderclap. Martinez and Thompson sat frozen, their expressions a mixture of shock and fear. The judge called for a brief recess, giving everyone time to absorb what had just transpired. By the time the session resumed, the tone had shifted completely. The prosecution offered no further arguments, and the judge dismissed the charges against Michael immediately. But that was only the... As Michael stepped outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed him, cameras flashing and microphones thrust. "Chief Carter, do you have a statement about the case?" One called. Michael raised his hand, signaling for silence. The crowd stilled, eager for his response. "This case isn't just about me," he began, his voice steady and resolute. "It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that every person, regardless of who they are, is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve. As a police chief, I'm committed to creating a department that values integrity and fairness. And as a citizen, I'll continue to fight for justice." He continued, but Michael didn't linger. He had more important matters to address. The case was swift. Martinez and Thompson were immediately suspended, pending an internal investigation. Public outrage grew as the footage was released to the press, sparking protests and calls for reform. Community leaders rallied together, demanding greater transparency and better training for officers. And Michael's leadership took on new significance. He called an emergency meeting, gathering officers in the precinct. Standing at the front of the room, he addressed them with unwavering conviction. "What happened to me last night wasn't an isolated incident," Michael said, scanning the room. "It was a symptom of a larger problem, and as long as I'm chief, I won't tolerate it. We are here to serve and protect, not to harass and intimidate. If you can't uphold those values, this isn't the place for you." The room was silent, his words cutting through any lingering doubt about his intention. Over the following weeks, Michael implemented sweeping changes. Mandatory bias training, stricter oversight, and an anonymous reporting system for officer misconduct were just the beginning. The community began to see a shift, though trust wouldn't be rebuilt overnight. Months later, Michael sat on a panel at a town hall meeting, listening as a young man stood up to speak. "Chief Carter," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "What you went through, it could have been me. It could have been any of us. Thank you for standing up, not just for yourself, but for all of us." His heart heavy but full of resolve. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he replied. "But together, we can build a system that truly serves everyone." All ended. Michael lingered for a moment, watching people file out with renewed hope. He knew the fight wasn't over, but he was ready for it. And now, it's up to us, the viewers and the community, to keep that fight alive. If we see injustice, we must speak up. If we want change, we must demand it. Together, we have the power to create a world where accountability isn't just a promise,